Okay, everybody, good morning. Okay, so
I'm telling you. Last trade thing we talked about.
last week we spent a lot of time in trying to understand. Second here, let's see if this works. Hang on a sec. Technology. Okay, so last thing we spoke about was this idea that certain materials have different qualities to them. We spoke about the source that appears in Chumash Vayikra, where it discusses carbonos that were cooked in different kinds of utensils. In other words, what happens if a carbon is cooked in a metal utensil? So the Torah tells us that after the period of time during which the carbon can be eaten has passed, in other words, we're past the deadline and the carbon can no longer be eaten, the utensil has to be dealt with because the utensil has absorbed this microscopic essence that we mentioned last week, this tam, into its walls. So if it's a metal utensil, so the Torah tells us it can be dealt with by extracting the tam from the pot, from the walls of the pot, and therefore you can now use the pot for anything else. But if it is not a metal pot, if it is an earthenware, I'll just call it earthenware for right now. If it is an earthenware utensil, so then the only thing that can be done to it, or the only thing that will enable you to use it again, is to break it. In other words, there's no way to completely get the tam, to completely get that microscopic essence that's been absorbed into the walls of an earthenware utensil. There's no way to get that out of the utensil. Why? We don't know. Torah tells us, right? The Torah tells us that's the nature of earthenware, what we call in Hebrew cheres, right? Sometimes cheres is translated as pottery, ceramic. These are all similar kinds of terms. We'll try to understand them a little bit more today. But this idea of pottery, cheres, earthenware, the Torah itself tells us that it doesn't exude what it has absorbed. So there's no way to kasher it because I can't possibly get it out of the walls of that kli. Okay? So that translates not only from carbonos, but that translates into kashrus as well. Meaning that if I use a pot and I cook something which isn't kosher in a pot, so I need to remove from the walls of the pot that microscopic essence that the pot has absorbed, that tam that the pot has absorbed. How do I do that? I do that if it's a metal pot through the mechanism, the same way in which it got absorbed into the pot, that's the way in which it comes out from the pot, right? That's an expression that we use in kashrus. Essentially, kibolo, the way in which it was absorbed, kach polto, that's the way in which it comes out. So if I cooked treif mac and cheese in a pot, how did my treif mac and cheese get absorbed into the walls of the pot? Through the medium of a hot liquid. What's the hot liquid? whatever is in the mac and cheese that's liquid that, ultimately makes it cook, whether it's milk or whether it's water, whatever it is, there's a hot liquid. The hot liquid was the way in which the ta'am of the treif mac and cheese got into the walls of the pot. Good. How do I get the treif, the ta'am of the treif mac and cheese, which is in the walls of the pot? How do I get it out of the walls of the pot? A liquid also, meaning I let the pot sit for 24 hours. Then I fill the pot with water and I boil the water. The water pulls out whatever ta'am is in the walls of the pot, and the water nullifies whatever ta'am comes into it from the walls of the pot, because the pot is filled. We say the water is 60 times the amount of the volume of the walls of the pot. Good. Okay. That's if I have a metal pot. Well, you put in water and then you boil it. In other words, it has to reach the temperature. It has to reach the same temperature that it reached to put things in. In other words, whatever you cooked in there, right? You cooked that treif mac and cheese, that it reached a certain temperature. So that's the same temperature that you're going to need to get the ta'am out of the walls of the pot. Okay, good. So that's if I have a pot and I used a hot liquid to transfer the ta'am. What if I didn't use a hot liquid to transfer the ta'am? What if I transferred the ta'am directly onto the utensil? How could that be? A metal. We're talking metal utensil right now.
How would you do that?
How would I do that?
Heat an empty pot?
How would I do that?
Use a recipe.
I take a frying pan. And what do I do in my frying pan? On my frying pan, I decide that I'm going to fry some sausage. I think the sausage is kosher sausage. And sure enough, turns out I made a mistake in the store. It's not kosher sausage. It's not the vegetarian sausage I thought it was. It's treif sausage. Treif sausage. But the sausage and the frying pan are in direct contact with each other. Now it is true, maybe I sprayed some Pam or something on the frying pan, but the bottom line is that there was direct contact between the food and the frying pan. There was not a medium of a liquid that was present. So there was direct absorption of the food, of the hot food, into the frying pan. So how do I get that out? I can. It's just complicated. Right? How do I get it out? Anybody know? Blowtorch. Okay, blowtorch. Right? You never heard of koshering anything with a blowtorch?
Kitchens they do that.
Right? What's the idea? How are you going to kosher this frying pan? So you have to heat up the frying pan to at least the same temperature that it was heated up to when it absorbed the ta'am that was there. How do you do that? So that's where the halacha says you need to have a direct heat source on the frying pan. And you have to make the frying pan red hot. So you can't make a frying pan red hot on the stove. That's not going to help. How do you make a frying pan red hot? With a blowtorch. Make a frying pan red hot with a blowtorch. There's two problems with this. Number one, it's dangerous, right? It's very dangerous. Number two, it's going to ruin your pan, right? Number two, it's going to ruin your pan. So how do you kosher a frying pan? Oh, okay. So Brenda is suggesting that we have a modern day equivalent to a blowtorch that is safer to use and distributes heat more evenly than a blowtorch. And that is a self-clean oven, right? A self-cleaning oven reaches a very high temperature. I believe it's 900, 800, 900, very hot temperature. And if you can take your frying pan, put it in your self-cleaning oven, then assuming that it's still a frying pan when the oven is finished, you could use it, right? Now, again, you have to be very careful here of several things. First of all, that you don't damage the oven, because sometimes your self-cleaning ovens, the warranty is void if you self-clean with something in the oven. So you don't want to damage your oven. Number two, if your frying pan has like a plastic handle, not a good idea, right? Because if your frying pan has a plastic handle, that will obviously melt in the oven, and probably the self-clean cycle will discolor the frying pan. However, it could work. I've seen it done with an iron skillet, right? Cast iron skillet. If you have a cast iron skillet that has become not kosher, so cast iron skillet in a self-cleaning oven, just laugh. They laugh at each other, right? It's not a problem at all. So that's the equivalent of the blowtorch. Now, kashrus agencies still use blowtorches when they go, let's say, into a treif kitchen, and they're going to kosher things in the kitchen. They're going to kosher the oven. Right? They're going to kosher an oven in the kitchen. So we want to kosher an oven for Pesach, or we want to kosher an oven in between milchiks and fleishiks. So we can kosher an oven. How do we kosher an oven? If it's self-clean oven, you run it through a self-clean cycle. That koshers the oven. It's so hot it koshers the oven. What if it's not a self-clean oven?
Wait 24 hours.
You have to wait 24 hours. You have to clean it with a caustic cleaner, and then you have to turn it up to the highest temperature it's ever been at for as long as it's ever been. All right, that's how you kosher a regular oven. When kashrus agencies come into a commercial establishment, they don't have time to do that. So how do they kosher the oven? Well, they kosher the oven with the blowtorch, but they don't use a blowtorch like, we use a blowtorch. They use a blowtorch, which is a big blowtorch connected to a propane tank, right? This huge blowtorch, and they literally are able to burn out the entire oven with this huge blowtorch, and that's it. Okay. So that's if it's a Ghostbusters. That's if it's a utensil that can be kosher. But what if it's a utensil that can't be kosher? Because we can't pull the tom out of it, like cheres. We can't pull the tom out of cheres, out of this pottery, this earthenware. We learned that by karbanos. It's the same thing by any tom that gets absorbed into it. We can't pull it out. So if we can't pull it out, what do we do? It's finished. Can't use it. I mean, you could use it maybe to display fruit. You could put a nice doily on it, but you can't use it for anything hot. You can't use it for anything hot. There is one possible way of koshering it, right? One possible way of koshering it, and that is to do the self-cleaning oven trick on this piece of earthenware. Now, that's a little bit complicated. It's complicated because it might break. This earthenware piece that you have might break. So you have to just know going into it that it might break. If you really need to kosher it and you don't want to use your self-cleaning oven, you should take it to a kiln, right? I've had families who have become balei tshuva and they've had not kosher earthenware. And what they've done is they've taken this earthenware to a potter who refires all of the earthenware in a kiln. Now, this will take us a little bit into our discussion of China. Okay? So,
Not the country.
China, not the country. China, not the country. Well, China, partly the country. That's how the dishes got their name. You know that. Why are China dishes called China?
I know. They developed the type of pottery.
China dishes are called China because the clay from which they were originally made came from China, right? So they call them China. Anyway, so let's just talk for a moment about these things because It's a little bit confusing. Ceramic, right? Porcelain. What are these things? So there are items that are subsumed under this general category of either ceramic slash porcelain, what we call cheres. So I want you to think about them as follows. There's earthenware, there's stoneware, and there's china, right? Or china is really what's called porcelain, right? Earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain slash china. What are these things? What are these things? Any of you have earthenware dishes? So how do they, all three of these things are made in the same fundamental way. They are made from materials from the earth. They are put together, right? And usually through the method of some liquid or something, they're put together. And they are then fired in an oven called a kiln. Have any of you ever made pottery?
Yes.
So that's what this is, right? Pottery, you take your clay and you shape it into whatever you want, and then you put it in the kiln. What does the kiln do? At a very high temperature, the kiln transforms this clay object into a solid object, right? This clay object into a solid object. Now, what's the problem with it now? So, in all likelihood, if you drop it on the floor, it's going to shatter because it's not considered very strong, right? This is earthenware. It's not considered very strong, and it's very absorbent. If you were to cook something in earthenware, whatever you cooked in the earthenware would be completely absorbed in the earthenware. The earthenware would be discolored, and generally earthenware is not used for cooking kinds of purposes. It's used for decorative purposes, not used for cooking kinds of purposes. Any of you have stoneware dishes? Right? When I got married, I first got married, I had stoneware dishes. Okay? Stoneware, what are stoneware dishes? So they are made from a different material than earthenware, and they are fired to the point where they become vitrified. Hear that expression? Which I never did until I researched this. Until they become vitrified, which basically means V-I-T-rified, all right? Which basically means that they're heated to such an extent that the all of the moisture is pulled out. They become very solid, and they develop a kind of sheen, like a glaze on top of them, okay? They're more durable. Stoneware is more durable than earthenware, and stoneware is actually used for, not for cooking so much, but used as plates, dishes, things like that. And then there is something called porcelain slash china. Porcelain slash china, what is that? That is a special kind of clay mixture that came from this place in China, which now is available, right? We have it all over the world, but it's still called China because that's where it came from. That is fired multiple times at very high temperatures. That is completely vitrified, and that is coated with a glaze to it. Okay. Now, what's bone china? What's bone china?
More expensive.
Yes, bone china is more expensive. But what makes it bone china? Well, what makes it bone china is because there is bone in it. Animal bone Animal bone in bone china,
Dishes.
right? Animal bone in bone china. In order for it to be considered bone china in the United States, the requirement is that it has to have 25% of bone ash. That 25% of its composition has to be bone ash. Now, wait a second. Does that mean that I'm eating my dinner on the bones of a, I don't know, who knows, a cow, a pig, or whatever? Right? So the answer is I don't have to worry about it. Why don't I have to worry about it? Because it's bone ash. In other words, the bones are completely burnt. They become ash. Right? Once they are completely burnt and they become ash, they lose their identity. It doesn't matter if it was a pig bone, if it was a giraffe bone, I don't know, what a hippopotamus bone, it's irrelevant. Right? It loses its identity, right? But that's what makes it bone china. Right now, you know why it's so expensive. Now, something even more interesting and a little bit weird is that bone china in other countries can actually have human bone ash in it. So you could theoretically be eating dinner on Aunt Bessie, right? In other words, in certain places, they make china out of the remains of people who were cremated, right? There's human bone ash in China. Now, okay. All right, now, let me ask you a question. If porcelain/china and stoneware and earthenware are all made in fundamentally the same way, and they are absorbent, right? They should be absorbent. So we would have a problem koshering them, right? Because that's kli cheres, that's what the Torah tells us. So that applies to certainly earthenware, but stoneware and particularly china and especially bone china have a glass-like coating that is fired onto the china. In other words, after that china has become hardened, they then take a glass, it's actually like a liquid glass, and they fire it onto the china, which helps to make it not absorbent. So if it's not absorbent, so then why can't we use it? And if it's not absorbent, isn't it like glass? Right? Shouldn't it be like glass? Why do we treat china differently than we treat glass? So the halacha says that glass formed by itself is one entity. Glass which is melted onto another object, glass which is melted onto another object assumes the quality of the object onto which it's absorbed. So the glass melted onto the china becomes halachically like the china, right? Whereas regular glass is glass. Regular glass is glass. So as a result of that, china that becomes trafed up, you can't use it. You can't use it, okay? Stoneware that becomes trafed up, you can't use it. Earthenware that becomes trafed up, you can't use it. You can have it rekilned, and sometimes it's worth it. Right? Sometimes it is worth taking your Alta Bubby's very expensive china that you're not sure what she used it for, and having it rekilned because china is very expensive, right? So sometimes it's worth it. Rav Moshe actually has a tshuva. It's an interesting tshuva. Rav Moshe writes that in the case of a Baal tshuva, right, someone who has, a full set of china that they use for something that was treif, and it would be a tremendous loss for them financially, and also emotionally, if they had to throw out this china. So Rav Moshe is lenient in this particular circumstance, that if it's allowed to sit for a year, it can then be immersed in boiling water to kasher it. And indeed, there are times when we rely on this heter. There are some rabbis who rely on this heter more than the particular case that Rav Moshe mentioned, and will tell you that if you trafed a piece of china, that's what you can do, right? I'm not comfortable with that, right? I think that if you, it depends how much of a financial loss it's going to be. But so that's what we're talking about here when it comes to kli cheres. That's the kli cheres and its kashrus component, okay? Kli cheres that we're talking about here is in a tuma and tahara perspective. And kli cheres has a very interesting status to it. We learn from a kashrus perspective, it's very stringent, right? From a kashrus perspective, if my piece of cheres becomes in some way treif because it absorbs the tam of something, I can't kasher it, or it's very difficult to kasher, nearly impossible to kasher. But when it comes to the laws of Tumah and Tahara, kli cheres has an interesting quality to it. And what is that? So let's imagine, okay, we're all in a room and there's a dead body in the room. Okay, you all look awake, it's a good sign. There's a dead body in the room. And in the room, there's, let's say, utensils, and those utensils are filled with food or drink, okay? What's the status of those utensils, and what's the status of the food inside of them? Not treif. We're not talking about kosher and treif here. We're talking about tahor and tameh. What's the status? They're all covered. They all have covers on top.
They're fine.
They're fine, says Brenda. Okay, they're fine. Anybody want to disagree with Brenda? All right. So it all depends on what they're made out of. If they are made out of, let's say, metal, so we have the following. When a person dies, a Jewish person dies in a room, the air of the room transmits the tumah from this dead body. As long as it's in a contained area, it transmits the tumah from this dead body, right? And that air carries the tumah from the dead body to any utensil that is there. So if I have a metal pot and my metal pot has cholent in it and it's uncovered, it becomes tameh. But even if it's covered, it becomes tameh. Why? Because as soon as this tumah, which is being transmitted through the air, touches the outside of the pot becomes tameh. Once the pot becomes tameh, the food inside the pot becomes tameh. Okay?
Without heat, even without communicating it with
Tumah and tahara do not need heat. Heat is only kosher. Right? Tumah and tahara is exposure. Right? If I'm exposed, is that cold? Right?
It could be the hot air displacing the cold air.
Well, it must have been, it may have gone up higher than the thermostat would say.
It says it's heat, but I'm going to raise the setting.
Well, freeze.
Let's see. Hopefully it will get warmer. Okay.
What if you have a plant in there? Does the plant get thrown out too?
No, wait a second. So again, remember, Tumah and Tahara today, right? Tumah and Tahara today,
Nothing.
but we don't do it. I mean, we're all tameh. Everything is tameh today. Right? Everything is tameh, right? So Tumah and Tahara, I'm talking about a time where Tumah and should I shut it off? Talking about a time when Tumah and Tahara were more relevant. Sadly, today they're not relevant to us. Hopefully tomorrow when the Beis HaMikdash is built, it will be more relevant to us. But right now, it's not so relevant to us, right? But yes, If you had a pot in a house, so it would become tummy, right? The pot would become tummy, the food inside would become tummy, unless it was in a cheres pot. Unless it was in a cheres pot, in a earthenware, stoneware, or porcelain / china pot. Why? Because when it comes to tuma, this kind of substance has an advantage. And what is that advantage? That advantage is it can only become tameh from the inside. It can't become tameh from the outside, right? Every other pot, every metal pot, I'm just going to shut up. Every metal pot that we have lying there,
It's snowing.
okay, it's gonna go off. The question is it going to go off or is it going to snow first? Okay, so right, so only if the tuma that's being transmitted through the air can get inside of this kli cheres, can it be mitame the kli cheres? But if the kli cheres is sealed, so then whatever is the kli cheres itself and whatever is in the kli cheres does not become tameh.
It's not sealed.
If it's not sealed and the tuma has a way of getting into the interior of it, then it becomes tameh. But otherwise it doesn't, right? Why? Because the Torah tells us, right? That the Torah, I mean, these laws of tuma and tara are not always easy for us to understand. They're not always, many of them are logical, but not all of them are rational, logical for us to understand. So that's what the Torah tells us about a kli cheres. We have to assume it has something to do with the nature of the material and the way in which a kli cheres is made. So as long as I have a kli cheres and it's sealed, then whatever is in it, as well as it, does not become tameh, because it can't become tameh from the outside of it. Okay, so let me show you that. Let's look inside page 840. We're still on page 840, right? Page 840. Okay, pasuk 15. I know you feel right. Right, pasuk 15. V'chol kli fatuach. Right, any open vessel, right? Any open vessel. Asher ein tzamid pasil alav, that does not have a covering sealed on it, tamehu. It is tameh. Such a utensil is tameh. Says Rashi, if you look down at Rashi, Rashi is in the left column, the third line. Rashi says, "V'chol kli fasuach," says Rashi, "Bekli cheres hakasav medaber." What's the Torah talking about? A kli cheres. It's talking about a pottery, a piece of pottery, or earthenware, or stoneware, or china. Bekli cheres hakasav medaber. She'ein mikabel tuma migabo, because kli cheres doesn't become tameh from the outside. Migabo is from the outside. Ella mitocho, it only becomes tameh if the tuma has a way of being transmitted to the interior, to the inside of the utensil. Lefichach. Im ein magofes tzmidaso psula alav yafa bechibor tamehu. If it's not sealed tightly, and there's a way for the outside air, which is transmitting this tuma, to get inside of it, then it becomes tameh. Otherwise, ha'im yesh tzamid pasil alav, if it has this seal over it, so then it's fine. Then it is tahor. You can use. What?
Only earthenware.
Only earthenware. Any other kind of utensil in the house becomes tameh. There is one exception. It's an interesting exception. and that is actual stone. Not stoneware, but actual stone utensils. But actual stone utensils. Stone utensils do not become tamei. Stone utensils do not become tamei. And interestingly, that is when they do archaeological excavations, they find in Yerushalayim, they find stone utensils.
I went to visit Iran and I saw stone pots.
Stone pots.
Stone pots.
Not stoneware, right? Stone pots.
Stone pot, and it's divided inside. So they can cook all kinds of food in one
Interesting.
pot.
Right? Stone does not become tamei. So the Kohanim used to eat with stone utensils, right? To avoid the possibility of tumah. Right? So there are stone utensils. So stone would not become tamei, but most people don't have actual stone utensils. In fact, even our countertops that we think are stone are sometimes not pure stone. Right? Sometimes they're not pure stone. Right? So stone would not become tamei, but any other kind of utensil that's there would become tamei, and the food inside of it would become tamei as well. So glass, we say glass has this special status to it that glass doesn't absorb. All right, so since glass doesn't absorb, what happens with tumah? I'm not sure about tumah. I'm not sure how tumah affects glass. An interesting question. I'm not sure. So Pyrex is treated halachically like glass. Right? Pyrex is treated halachically like glass. Okay. Now the difference is if I'm an Ashkenazi. Remember we learned, right? I'm an Ashkenazi, so I can't use glass to cook with. Meaning I can't use Pyrex to cook both milchiks and fleishiks. Obviously not at the same time. But if I'm a Sephardi, I can. Right? If I'm a Sephardi, I can. Obviously not at the same time. But if I'm a Sephardi and I have a Pyrex dish, I can use Pyrex to cook something, meat, and then I can use Pyrex to cook dairy. I just have to clean it out in between. Right? Ashkenazim don't have such luxuries. Right? We don't get to do that, right? So, yes.
Microwave
Is microwave?
Microwave works. Would you be able to use a glass microwave?
No, because what happens is, I assume you're referring to the fact that the heat, that it's the food that gets heated, and not the utensil that gets heated. However, generally, when you cook something in a microwave, the utensil is hot. Utensil is hot because the food is hot in a microwave. Because the food is hot in the microwave. Interesting question about the glass of a microwave. Can you use the glass turntable? Can you use it for both milchiks and fleishiks? I'll leave that up in the air, right? Ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Okay.
You don't put food directly on it. But still, it's.
But you don't put food directly on it, but maybe food spills over. I mean, whenever I do something in the microwave, inevitably food spills over. So, okay. So the Torah tells us that if you have this in the house, in the ohel where a person has died, you have a kli cheres, which is not sealed, then it becomes tamei. But otherwise, if it's sealed, it doesn't become tamei, and whatever is inside of it doesn't become tamei. Okay. Then the Torah goes back. We spoke about ohel. Now the Torah goes back to a case of pure touch. And the Torah says in verse Tes Zayin, V'chol asher yiga al penei hasadeh, and anything he shall touch in the open field. B'chalal cherev, the body, a corpse that was killed by the sword, o v'meis, or just a corpse that wasn't killed by the sword, but that died in some other way. O be'etzem adam, or the bone of a person. O bekever, or a grave, yitma shiv'as yamim. What happens? That you are tameh for 7 days. Meaning, if I'm in a room with a dead body, if I'm in a room with a Jewish corpse, I'm tameh. If I'm in a field with a Jewish corpse, on the street with a Jewish corpse, so I don't become tameh unless I touch the corpse.
What about
Right?
wars? What about when they had the wars when the temple was built?
People would
So-
have to, right?
Does
If
that incapacitate the army though, when it happens, or
only, it doesn't incapacitate the army. The army just soldiers have to go through a process of Torah.
come back home?
Right, they have to go, and in those days it was much different. In those days, when you killed somebody, you were up close and personal. Right? Today, you know, in war they kill people. You don't even, I don't even know it's people.
Remotely.
Right? They don't even know it's people. Right? So, but if you had a sword and you killed somebody with a sword, you would become tameh. Okay. Now, or not only a corpse, but a bone. Right? A bone from a person. If you touch a bone of a person, you become tameh. Not obviously a bone of an animal, but a bone of a person, you become tameh. Or if you touch a kever, you touch a grave, so then you become tameh. And that tuma is a tuma of shivas yamim, of seven days. Now, there's a very interesting Rashi here. Look at the Rashi, 4 lines up from the bottom in the left column, al pinei hasadeh. So Rashi, sometimes Rashi gets very involved in dikduk, in grammar, and sometimes he tells it to us and sometimes he doesn't. So this interpretation of Rashi here is based on grammar. Rabboseinu darshu, the rabbis understood this, lirabos, to include golel vidofek, a golel vidofek. What's a golel and what's a dofek? A golel is the top of the coffin, right? The top, that enclosure with that board on the top of the coffin, that's called a golel. A dofek is the wall of a coffin, right? The wall of a coffin, right? Probably terms that we're not familiar with. Right. Well, dofek and dofen, maybe they're related, but dofek, right? It's not dafnot, right? It's not dofen, it's dofek. Okay. So those are the walls of the coffin, of the casket. So if a person touches the casket, he or she becomes tameh. You touch the top of it. If you touch the sides of it, you become tameh. Now, certainly the people who are carrying it become tameh, right? But you might say, well, the person is inside and the person is sealed off, right? So if the person is inside and the person is sealed off, I'm not touching the person. You're right, you're not touching the person, but we learned that you become tameh not only through touching a corpse, but you also become tameh through carrying a corpse. And when you carry the casket, you are carrying the corpse without touching it. So anybody who's carrying the corpse becomes tameh in this process. But even if you're not carrying the corpse, let's say you just put your hand on the casket, put your hand on the coffin. People do that all the time. Put their hand on the coffin, put their hand on the casket, you become tameh. Tumas meis, 7 days. Now, again, we don't think about it because we're all tameh meis. But that's, right, Tumas meis, 7 days, that's what happens. This phrase that Rashi introduces, right, this idea that l'rabos, the pasuk comes to include these things. Where's Rashi getting it from? He's getting it from the strange grammar of the pasuk. Because the pasuk begins by saying, V'chol asher yiga al penei hasadeh. And whoever touches, comma, in an open field, comma, whatever. What should follow right after whoever touches? Whoever touches a particular thing. I don't know, I'm not a grammar person, but there's a word for that, all right? The verb has to be attached to something, whatever it's called, I don't know. But what in normal usage, the verb and what it's attached to are in proximity to each other. There's not something separating them. Here, something is separating between the verb and its object. And that causes the rabbis to say, well, the Torah is trying to teach me something else. And that's according to the way Rashi understands it, according to rabbis, l'rabos es hagolel v'es hadofek. Okay. Now, here's the question. So you know that when someone dies, right? Someone dies, and it's one of the relatives for whom you are responsible, one of the 7 relatives for whom you are responsible, and you're notified of the death. So the moment you are notified of the death, you become an onin, right? You are in this most intense period of mourning. You're not allowed to eat meat. You're not allowed to drink wine. And you are obligated to observe most of the laws of Shiva already. Not all of them. You don't have to wear non-leather shoes. You don't have to sit in a low chair. But other than that, the laws of Shiva apply to you already. That's an onin.
Remember you told me we can't even say brachot.
Correct. You're exempt from all mitzvos aseh, right? You're exempt from all mitzvos aseh. What?
After the burial, you could make brachot.
You have to make brachot after the burial. Okay. Now, so here's the question. You become an onin the minute you're informed that someone of those 7 relatives has died. Let's say nobody tells you.
I don't know. It happened to me.
Right? Nobody tells you. You're not in Avelis.
No.
Right? And sometimes we actually employ that. Meaning, let's say that I'm making a chasana. Right? I'm making a wedding, and one of my relatives, one of those 7 relatives is in the hospital dying. So it's feasible, and it's actually sometimes practiced, where we'll tell people, do not call the son, right? When the mother dies, don't call the son because he's in the middle of the chasana. Don't call the son. As long as nobody tells him, then he doesn't know. And if he doesn't know, his Avelis doesn't start. After the chasana, someone tells him and his Avelis starts at that point. I don't know if any of you have ever been in similar kinds of situations. Right?
My father, when it was Chumash, his brother passed away in South Africa, and that's what you told him. You said, don't ask the questions till after that.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay, so that's right. I don't even remember. Okay, so right, so that sometimes we rely on because your Avelis begins when you hear. Now, very interesting. Let's say that you hear a week later, right? You know, the other part of the family is in California. You're not so in touch with them. Person dies there. You didn't hear until a week has passed. What's your obligation then when you hear? No, you have to sit Shiva. If you hear a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, you have to sit Shiva up till a month. Up till a month. If you hear anytime up to a month, even if you hear the day 29, you have to sit Shiva for a full week. If you hear after a month has elapsed, you sit Shiva for 1 day. If you hear after a month has elapsed, you sit Shiva for 1 day. And people actually use this if we have extraordinary circumstances. In other words, let's say we have someone, an elderly person, who can't sit Shiva, right? So then you would tell that person that one of his or her relatives has passed away an hour before the beginning of a Yom Tov, right? Because then, okay, that person's obligated to sit Shiva that day, sits Shiva for 10 minutes, and Yom Tov cancels Shiva.
So it's a compassionate,
Correct. So in other words, that's what's called a Shmua Rachoka. Let's say you hear 5 years later. Happens. You hear 5 years later that one of your relatives died. One day. One day. There is another time where you sit Shiva for 1 day. Anybody know what that is? Pinui Atzamos. Pinui Atzamos is when you disinter someone. Let's say you want to move someone to Israel. You disinter a body or whatever's left, and you transport that body to Israel. So there is a minhag that on the day of the disinterment, because of the disturbance which is created, you observe 1 day of Avelis, some of quasi kind of Avelis. Okay, so that's another situation. Pinui Atzamot. Pinui Atzamot. Now, back to our Golel question. When do I transition from being an Onain to being an Ovel? When do I transition from being an Onain to being an Ovel? Okay, after the funeral, right? But after the funeral is not so precise, right? Remember, we're Jews, right? Shabbos doesn't begin when it gets, right? This is the time, this is when it's over, right? This is if you live here, this zip code, that zip code, this shul, that shul. Okay, so when precisely during the burial does the transition between Aninus and Avelus start? Nope. It's called when there is stimat hagolel. The same word golel that Rashi uses here to refer to the top of the coffin, when there is stimat hagolel, when that is closed. Right now, it doesn't mean when the coffin, when the top is put on top, but it means when the grave is filled in. Did you ever notice that at the very end of filling in the grave, you want to make sure that the earth is higher than the surrounding ground, and somebody will actually create a mound in the middle. That's the technical point of stimat hagomel, right? That's why people who leave the cemetery, they'll take a few handfuls of earth and throw it into the grave and then leave. Their Avelis hasn't begun yet because the grave hasn't been filled in. There hasn't been stimat hagolel. Okay, and there are different opinions as to how much of the grave has to be filled in for there to be stimat hagolel. But this word golel that Rashi brings down here to tell us that if you touch a casket, if you touch the top or you touch the sides of the casket, so you become tamei even without carrying the mace, even without touching the mace, you become tamei. That word golel actually is a halachic has halachic significance for when Avelus, when mourning begins. Right? It doesn't begin when you walk through the line. You're already an Avel when you walk through the line. It begins when that final act of burial is done. And that has nothing to do with the rabbi speaking. That has nothing to do with the Kel Malei Rachamim. Has nothing to do with anything other than the earth physically being placed into the grave. Right? And it doesn't matter if the earth is placed into the grave, through people shoveling it in, which is ideally how we do it. Right? Sometimes it's too. I've been at funerals where the earth is too frozen. Right? To do that, you can't.
I had this with a patient a few years ago where one of her parents passed away. She was not Jewish, but they were up in Vermont, and they could not actually bury for months.
Could not bury for months. Correct.
So, I mean,
that happens.
Because she's not Jewish, but what would one do? Does one
right.
become
that right? So that actually happens. So what do you? Because the earth is so frozen that you can't dig a grave. Even the machines can't dig a grave.
You have to go back and bury like months later. She has to go back up to Vermont to bury.
Yeah. So what we would in all likelihood say is that you give the body over. It's interesting, Kay. Interesting thing to think about. you give the body over to someone else who assumes responsibility for it. And once you give the body over to someone else who assumes responsibility for it, that's when you begin Shiva. But I think that might only work if there was, let's say, a Chevra Kadisha that would take responsibility for it. I'm interesting. I don't know if it would work with a non-Jewish funeral home. It's an interesting question. For instance, if someone, let's say, is getting buried in Israel and you're not going, okay? So when that cargo door closes and the body is inside, that's when your Avelis begins. Okay, right there at the airport, that's where your Avelis begins. Even though the person won't be buried for another.
So when you can no longer assume any responsibility for the body, that's when your mourning period starts. In other words, if the body's in the plane, you can't do any more.
Correct, that's correct.
So at that point,
Or
done.
even if you hand it over to a Chevra Kadisha.
Right.
But if you hand it over to a Chevra Kadisha to bury and they're going to take care of everything and you're not going to be involved with it, that's when your Avelis begins. Okay? That's when your Avelis begins. Okay. So it's an interesting question.
She actually went back, though, to take care of the burial. I mean, again, this was not a Jewish woman, so it was not initially.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
I don't know where the body was kept.
Well, the bodies are kept in, right? They're kept in refrigeration, but even in refrigeration, they ultimately deteriorate. It's an interesting question. I have to ask Rabbi Zon. What one would do. And I mean, it's not conceivable that you would be an onain for months. That's not conceivable. So somehow there has to be a transfer of responsibility to someone else. Then if you go up to the burial, interesting question. But it does happen. But I was referring to a case where I've been at funerals where you can't fill it by hand because the earth which they've dug out is too frozen, right? It's frozen solid on top. And you can only fill the grave by a machine, right? So you fill the grave by a machine. That's what you do. I think that's what you do. Okay. That's, by the way, this is why you can't have unveilings in the winter because they say they can't set every stone that you have, every monument at the cemetery doesn't just sit on the earth. It actually sits on a base of concrete that is poured into a form in the earth so that it's stable, so that it doesn't, you go to a very old cemetery, you'll notice that the headstones are sometimes this way, that way, because the earth shifts, right? And earth shifts and, if it shifts, I mean, this is not something that we really relate to because we have homes with foundations and everything else. But if you have a country house that's built on concrete piers, so if those concrete piers are not set properly, over time your house begins to shift and walls crack and things like that. Okay, so back to here. So the pasuk tells us that if you touch obviously, if you touch the body, we've learned that already, but if you touch the instrument that killed the body, and in the case which Torah mentions here, it's a cherev, it's a sword, but it could be anything. Or if you touch that instrument that killed the body, or that killed the person, or you touch a bone of the person, or you touch the grave, so then you become tameh for 7 days. You become tameh for 7 days. And again, how do you get out of this tumah? So that's the process that we mentioned before, and that is the ashes of the paraduma. Pasuk 17, the Torah says, "V'lakchu latameh me'afar sreifas hachatas." You take, right, for the person who has become tameh through tumas meis, you take from the afar. It's interesting. How do you say ashes? Ashes are afer with an aleph, right? Ashes are afer with an aleph. In fact, if you look above, let's see. Yes, look just at the top of the page on the third line. The last word on that third line, v'chibes ha'osef es afer ha'para, right? As afer ha'para. Here, what's it referred to? Here it's referred to afar, right? It said, Torah tells us, v'lakchu latameh me afar sreifas hachatas, right? From the afar, which is the earth of this burnt para aduma, referred to here as a chatas. V'nasan alav mayim chayim el keli. And what do? You put mayim chayim on top of it in a kli, in a utensil. So this is the first step in the tahara process. You take the ashes, right, that is mixed with the earth, because remember where they burned the paraduma, when they scoop everything up, there's earth that's there as well. So you take the earth and the ashes of the para aduma, and you pour mayim chayim on top of that in a kli, right, in a utensil, right? You make this mixture. What's the recipe? How much of the ashes do I need to use? How much water can I use? Do the ashes become diluted in the water? Right? We learned that if there's 60 times whatever fell into the pot, so then whatever fell in becomes nullified under normal circumstances. Do I have to make sure that I put in less than 50 times, less than 60 times the amount of water in this kli? So we're going to talk about all of those things. And I create this mixture, and then I take v'lakach azov. I take an azov. What is azov? Hyssop, right? Hyssop, right? A lowly growing. It's a kind of vegetation. Might be a plant. I'm not sure. A kind of vegetation that grows close to the ground. Hyssop. So I take the hyssop. V'taval b'mayim ish tahor, and a pure person dips the hyssop into the mixture. V'hiza al ha'ohel, and he sprinkles it on the tent. V'al kol ha'kelim, and on all of the utensils. V'al ha'nefashos asher hayusham, and on the people who were there. V'al hanogeya, and on the person who touched, ba'etzem o bechalal o b'meis o b'kaber. Okay, so the hyssop becomes like a, I don't know what to call it, like a sprayer, like a sponge, like a paintbrush, right? That you dip the hyssop into the water and ashes mixture, and then you sprinkle that on the person. How much has to be sprinkled on the person? Torah doesn't tell us. I sprinkle just a little bit. Let's say I get 1 drop. So am I tahor with 1 drop?
Yeah.
Okay. Or do I need more? Right? Do I need to actually feel sprinkled?
I think it's a ritual.
Right? Do I need to actually feel sprinkled? What if they sprinkle towards me and it doesn't hit me? So am I sprinkled or not sprinkled? Right? So again, the Torah doesn't tell us any of these things. We only know them through Torah She'Ba'al Peh. We only know them through Torah She'Ba'al Peh. When is this sprinkling done? So that's the next pasuk. V'hizah hatahor al hatamei bayom hashlishi bayom hashvi'i. Done on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. V'chit'o bayom hashvi'i, and he becomes purified on the 7th day. V'chibes begadav, and he immerses his clothing. V'rachatz b'mayim, and he immerses himself in the water. V'taher ba'erev, and when evening comes, he becomes pure. Okay, that's the process of purification. The details of that process, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, will go through next week. Okay, next week, are we okay for class or not okay for class? No problem? First week in January, no problem?
No problem.
Good.
Excuse me, everybody, sorry, Rabbi. Tonight, the mother of Yossi Azan from Brooklyn at the house of God. The mother is giving brachot in Rabbi Abraham Cohen show. So please, everybody, and she needs support. She needs support. It's not